So I quite often get asked about what it's like when you start off on your career to become a designer. And sometimes this is by students who are still in their course looking to try and get jobs. But sometimes it's even kids who are still at high school or further education, maybe a sixth form college, and sometimes even by parents. And I'd say time and time again, I keep coming back to this book. It's called Universal Principles of Design by Lidwell, Holden, and Butler. And I honestly think it's like the quickest way to get an overview of most of the things that a designer slash product design engineer will be facing on a day-to-day basis. The fact that it's been revised and updated this is actually a second copy I've got, as I've given one away already, and it's still battered. So I kind of feel it's one of those ones that even when you consider yourself semi-experienced, you still sometimes look back at these and realise there's a lot of wisdom you've still got to accrue over the years. So what it does is just an A to Z of different terms, and the format is really lovely. And I'd say even if you're a parent or new to design, it's still very, very accessible. There's not a lot of jargon, and if anything, the whole point of the book is to bust through jargon. So if you've got a 16-year-old who's curious about design, this book is completely accessible. And if you've got someone who's 25 or whatever, this is still totally worth a read, just to keep yourself sharp and not getting slack on any of these points. So for example, this page is on affordance, property in which the physical characteristics of an object or an environment influence its function. It then goes on to say that in even more simpler terms and gives some nice examples that you can readily go Google, or you may well have at home anyway. Such as, nice squishy grips on potato peelers for people who originally had, the intent was for people who had trouble gripping, say osteoarthritis, and then actually realizing the brand just works well for a lot of people because it's got nice affordances. So again, this word keeps coming back, and you hear it a lot in design. Again, sort of Lego bricks having, very obvious plug and socket type arrangements, so it's intuitive to use. Debatable on Segway. I guess each of these examples have a little bit of a nod to what time they were published. But even sort of timeless things like push-pull on handles, which is more obvious, and you still see people get that wrong today with putting handles on doors which you're supposed to push. So, there you go. And I guess other examples, I just flip through, I won't go through all of them for copyright. Explaining how things like information are laid out, how our eyes naturally follow information on the page, hierarchy of needs. And I think what's helpful about this is not about whether you particularly believe in Maslow's hierarchy of needs still being, to be taken as gospel. But I think it's useful that quite often when you're a young graduate, you walk into a room and you hear all these terms bouncing around and you think, God, I don't know what that means. And I appreciate these days Google is there, but I think this honestly just gives you a nice feel of what matters and what doesn't. So instead of just endlessly Googling, I think this almost equips you with a sort of a sense of confidence that if you just started your first job, you wouldn't look a complete idiot. There's then some even things which I think actually you'll realize even people in an organization won't necessarily have heard. So again, one of the nice things here is not only does it discuss the illustration and the general principle, but it also gives essentially the references to where these things are. So this is actually a really nice thing called unintentional blindness, where it's a psychology experiment where you're told to watch how many times this ball gets passed around in a video, and people count the number of times, say it's 13 or 18, doesn't matter, and they answer it at the end of the test, and then they say, incidentally, did you see the gorilla? And what happens is this gorilla walks on screen, does that pose, and then walks off, and usually very few people notice it because they're so focused on the ball, they miss something as crazy and anomalous as a man in a gorilla suit walking on. And so I think these sorts of things are really interesting, and again, just sort of prime your mind as to what it's like to be a designer, or in many ways I sort of hope give some inspiration of like what the sort of dynamic is when you're in a job. Then there's things like, appreciate this may seem a little bit dated, but sort of nudge. What are behavioral nudges? This is a picture of a urinal with a little pattern of a fly on it, hoping that men will pee more accurately instead of all over the place when drunk or whatever. And again, of course, where would be about prototyping, showing, I think, just a really nice overview of different levels of prototype, understanding the basics of a mechanism. This is using sort of like Kappa board to sort of get a volumetric sort of quantity, and this is using something which is actually functional, though of course not chromed up and the finished product. So again, even breaking down what is the level of prototyping that is expected in a company. And I think this is actually a very good overview. I might add, for one page, it does it better than most. And then there's also engineering principles like redundancy. And again, it has some nice sort of silly examples of putting this fiberglass cow on top of a crane, which I'm guessing had to be bolted pretty intensively to the crane so it didn't blow off in the wind, and explaining how essentially redundancy was created so that this thing would never fail, or at least not in any reasonable circumstances. But taking a very engineering heavy principle and bringing it to something tangible, this is, I think, what the book does incredibly well. And then I think there's even just some fun things which start off as I would never do that, and then actually if senior engineers and principal engineers had a penny for every time they've seen younger or less experienced people fall foul of this, what's called the scaling fallacy, which is basically meaning that, we kind of think, this is the size of a bee, it can flap its wings and fly around, a little bit slower but a little bit bigger wings is a bird, a little bit slower and a little bit bigger wings is a human. Well, no, because it's a completely different scale of scaling. It's not necessarily linear, it's probably closer to logarithmic, and also, even though you're changing the size of the wings, you're not changing the density of the air. So of course this doesn't work as well as that or as well as that. So it's sort of being aware of certain principles like that. And of course the point isn't to become a scholar of simulated aerodynamics. The point is to go out and test things, just not necessarily jumping off a building with wings like that. So also other things which still seem to be in discussion. What is storytelling? At the minute this seems like a combination of BS and a bit of a black art, or indeed to anyone who's been using it for years without any of the aura surrounding it. It's just business as usual in how you communicate ideas and stage them in a way that people can follow it cleanly. So I think this is just a really good book. It doesn't try to be exhaustive. As I said, it takes 2 pages to explain one concept, and I think you get a huge amount of bang for your buck in terms of what it would be like to be a product designer. So the other angle that I wanted to cover was just that was, shall we say, on a more taking a more personal journey. I think I should maybe start with this this one here, which is I think it's really, really hard to get hold of, so forgive me for exhibiting it, but and indeed forgive the name if it offends anyone, but I think it's a fair statement that Lee McCormack's Designers Are Wankers was trying to basically burst the bubble that you tend to leave university with a pretty high opinion of yourself, and of course it's blunted by reality, and that doesn't mean to say that it's helpful to always feel downtrodden. Of course, as a designer, you got to pick yourself up and carry on again. But at the same time, I think the book goes a good way, almost like a sort of companion, to sort of say, on the one hand, it's great that you've got youthful enthusiasm, and you're probably right some of the time, but it has to be tempered with a healthy dose of reality as well. And so I think even, I'm not going to get into each of it because it's mostly text in here, but, clients, they write the checks. And so it's kind of acknowledging that, okay, if you want to be an artist and set all the rules yourself, be ready to live like an artist. Either have a rich patron or accept that you're going to go Vincent van Gogh and be poor when you die. Or you work for an agency where you have to acknowledge that the client, a little bit like the customer, is always right to a greater or lesser extent. And so working within that honesty is something where if you want to work for IDEO or Frog or any of these big consultancies, the end of the day, however dynamic the books are, they still got to abide by the business sense. So it's just being really, really honest without too much allegiance to any one company here. Again, just reality checks on talking to venture capitalists. If you decide, nope, it's not for me, I'm going to go solo, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, good for you. But again, some hard-won lessons, which I think Lee does a good job of saying without sounding too jaded or cynical, but just good heads up on what to expect. Again, I appreciate negative sounding title, but, understanding, when not to be too naive, and maybe be a little bit aware that the deal is afoot. And again, he does a nice job of putting in some good interviews with people, so it's not just one person's singular perspective on things. So I'd say that this was also a huge inspiration to me, and even though it's not, should we say, a traditional design engineer's book, Stefan Sagmeister, this book's called Made You Look. It's very much a sort of exploration of all sorts of kind of crazy ideas, and he was working with all sorts of different sort of usually album art, I think, at the peak of his album career in music and all that sort of stuff. But I think the bit that I took from it wasn't just that, he's obviously incredibly experienced graphic artist, even down to the detail of the book. I mean, this is silvered here, and then when you bend it, it has all sorts of, little things. There's an animation going on in some of the top corners here. It's just incredibly rich as a creative book. And I think what's nice about it is that you really get the sense of someone's style and individuality still having to be tempered with the realities of paying the bills, basically. And I think, if anything, this is the most useful thing that I think to not just graphic designers, but any designers, is he even has some pretend day in the life of himself, with all the problems of going to work, dealing with clients, and so he kind of goes through blow by blow, that sort of stuff. I'm having to be a little bit careful here, as dare I say it, depending whether you're easily afraid of quite a lot of sexual references, I would say maybe make a sort of decision on whether your 16-year-old or whoever you're going to buy this for is comfortable with that. So don't blame me if you're easily offended. But I'd say, this is kind of 18 certificate book. But dare I say, if you're the aunt or uncle, you'd get to be the cool one, giving them something that's a little bit edgy. But I think ultimately the takeaway is it's a reasonably, even though it likes to pass itself off as being very cool and flippant and, doesn't care, I think the point is it's still written from a good place of someone who has really had to walk that long journey of starting from nothing to building something up for themselves. And I guess I'd say one thing, even though I sort of show this book with a little bit of a cringe in the title, because it feels very, I don't know, American dream, and that somehow everything in life is just about you turning the key and walking through the door, and obviously there's no other setbacks in life which might hold you back, which, so basically take it with a pinch of salt. But I would say that sometimes even these books, as Instagram advice as they feel, there's one thing that really stuck from me of this, which is why I've kept the book, even though it's a bit cringeworthy, is give away everything you know. And I'd say, even, to be honest, and more will come back to you, is not necessarily the thing that drives you. The thing that I took from this is just almost this fear of that it said, the hoarder, she's already reducing her capabilities. And I kind of feel that one of the best bits of advice from this book, and I've seen this in numerous people since I started out, is just this sense of, if you hoard things and rest on your laurels, you're just going to be going around in circles. And so giving away everything you know, I think it proves to you that you don't become a perfectionist, and it's actually okay to put something out that's just good enough. But I think secondly, you get dynamic, especially with the internet. You're getting a continual feedback loop on what people think. Of course, you don't have to listen to all of it, That goes without saying. But I think the most important thing is it keeps you sharp. There is a sense of, I've put that out, I'll let it run its course, but I need to move on to the next thing. And so in many ways, these videos, I feel, are that for me. These book reviews are ultimately the basics, and I hope to get into sort of more interesting stuff as I learn the craft or the format, and indeed if it works. So please like it in that case if you want to see more. So hope that's useful. Sorry, that was by Paul Arden, Stefan Sagmeister, Lee McCormack, and Lidwell, Holden, and Butler. And so I hope that's useful. Thanks very much, and do post any comments or any other questions.